Hello there, I am the Midnight Time Traveler, and unfortunately for me, we're traveling back to the medieval times today. I know you may be using this video to fall asleep, so before that, make sure to like the video and subscribe. Also, where are you from, and what time are you watching? Now, get comfortable, relax, and let's begin. I blinked into a gray haze, half convinced I'd simply overslept in my own bed. The sharp sting of damp straw beneath me told a different story. Rising to my elbows, I drew in a lungful of fetid air, scented with last week's ale and the unmistakable perfume of livestock. My head pulsed, as though the entire universe were thumbing its nose at me. A quick survey revealed a low-beamed wooden ceiling, blackened by centuries of smoke. The walls, if one could call them that, were roughly hewn planks, crooked and pocked with insect burrows. Outside, a rooster crowed twice, his voice cracking with age, or perhaps indigestion. I swung my legs over the edge of what passed for a bed, a narrow pallet stuffed with straw, only marginally softer than the floor. Groaning, I donned my trousers, a pair of coarse wool that scratched like 1,000 tiny needles and tugged on a tunic of faded hemp. The fabric was stiff as cardboard, smelling faintly of sweat and cheap. Venturing into the corridor, I noticed narrow slits in the walls where light fought its way through chinks in the wood. A crude ladder led upward. I ascended onto a roof of weathered shingles, slick with morning dew. From this vantage point, the settlement sprawled around a muddy track that served as the main street. Lean wattle and daub houses clustered like mismatched puzzle pieces, each topped with a thatched roof that threatened to collapse under the weight of a heavy winter. I'd expected something quaint, picturesque, cottages straight from a fairy tale. Instead, I saw that life here was a relentless grind. Smoke curled from hearths, mingling with the haze of cooking fires. Chickens scratched at the mud for scraps, oblivious to their fate in a pot later that day. Men in tunics of drab browns and greens hefted buckets from a communal well, their faces set in resigned determination. Women in linen dresses hauled bundles of firewood, their skirts stained to the knees. As I made my way down to the street, a small boy darted past, clutching a wooden hoop and a stick. He glanced at me with wide, curious eyes, no doubt wondering how someone in such odd garb found himself here. I offered him a half-smile, which in hindsight must have looked like the twitch of a constipated owl. He giggled and took off, the hoop rolling merrily across market stalls piled high with cabbage heads, leather pouches, and the occasional bit of bright cloth, a rare luxury in a place where color meant wealth. I realized then I was not in any dreamy recreation of the past. I was in history, raw and unvarnished, and there was no turning back. My assignment remained clear: document every detail, every hardship, until the moment I finally lay down to sleep under this ancient sky. By mid-morning, the sun had climbed just high enough to banish the lingering chill but not the odors. As I threaded through the marketplace, I cringed at the pungent bouquet of goats, fermenting grain, and something distinctly rotting in a nearby cart. A haggard woman behind a stall beckoned me closer. "Fresh eggs," she called, lifting a basket where a speckled hen eyed me suspiciously. Farthings were tiny copper coins, 4 to a penny, whose worth barely covered a cabbage or a crust of bread. I peered at my own pouch, a handful of bright florins I'd brought unwisely, instantly drawing curious glances from onlookers. One disreputable fellow slipped near to inspect them, then hurried away as if fearing counterfeit magic. Across the muddy way, sparks flew from an open forge. The blacksmith, muscular arms dusted in soot, hammered a glowing horseshoe with deliberate rhythm. "Steady now, Thomas," he muttered, half to his iron and half to a skinny apprentice clutching tongs. Occasionally the apprentice cried out as a rogue spark hissed across his bare forearms, a hazard of the trade. I noted how essential blacksmiths were, from crafting tools and nails to shoeing the village's scrawny nags. Their work undergirded every aspect of daily life. A bell tolled from the church tower, its sonorous clang reminding villagers of the hour. Time here was as much governed by church bells as by any mechanical clock. Those were rarities, even in royal courts. Peals at sunrise, midday, and vespers guided rhythms of prayer, labor, and rest. I wondered what the medieval concept of breakfast even entailed. Most here ate little until after their daily chores, relying on leftover bread and ale. Moving on, I passed a crudely plastered latrine shed, guarded by a sign warning men only. The sight of it, an overgrown wooden box perched above a ditch, drove home the grim realities of medieval sanitation. Disease spread fast when human waste mingled freely with drinking water, and epidemics were a constant specter. I shuddered, imagining what studying anatomy must have been like before germ theory. No wonder life expectancy hovered around 35. By the time I reached the village, well, again, my fingers were slick with mud, and I was hungry beyond words. Tomorrow, I decided I would attempt a proper meal at the tavern if I survived that invitation. But first, notes. Always notes. As the church bell's final note faded, its echoes still trembling in my chest, I realized my stomach was staging a revolt. Medieval peasants seldom enjoyed luxuries like 3 balanced meals. Instead, they nibbled when they could. Nevertheless, I found myself at the village tavern's low doorway, where a swarthy innkeeper polished a wooden bench with a rag as threadbare as his patience. "The looking for a bite, stranger," he grunted, eyeing my odd tunic and the glint of those florins at my belt. I nodded, attempting what I hoped passed for polite eye contact. He muttered about stirrups rot, if ye know what I mean, then led me to a rough-hewn table, scarred by wine spills centuries old. Soon he returned with a lump of coarse rye bread, a wedge of cheese that looked more like clay, and a wooden bowl of pottage. Peering into its murky depths, I saw chunks of turnip, barley, and maybe a bit of salted pork. It smelled earthy. I swallowed before my gag reflex could strike. Curiously, the broth was hearty, enough to fuel a day's labor, but barely tackle modern cravings. As I ate, the innkeeper leaned in. "Tell me, lad, what brings thee to Stretford-on-the-Moor?" he asked, wiping his hands on his apron. I hesitated. Did I really want to explain I hailed from the 21st century? Instead, I offered a vague story about being a wandering scholar. He nodded, satisfied, though doubt flickered in his beady eyes. Between spoonfuls, I noted the tavern's fixtures. A rack overhead where garlands of dried herbs, rosemary, sage, perhaps yarrow, hung to ward off miasmas. Folk believed smells cured disease. Thus, they perfumed their hovels with lavender or burned bundles of rue, convinced it purged the foul air. These superstitions made me grateful for modern medicine, though I secretly admired the ingenuity born of necessity. By the time I left, the sun had passed its zenith. My tunic clung to me with the combined charm of sweat and broth, and I realized afternoon tasks awaited, tending livestock at the communal pens, collecting eggs, and perhaps observing the village apothecary mixing his curious remedies. But first, a quick dip at the stream to wash off the pottage, and to reassure myself I still tasted of toothpaste rather than turnips. I slipped down to the bubbling brook that bordered the village, hauling my tunic high above my knees. The water was icy enough to make me gasp, certainly more invigorating than the lukewarm baths of my own time. Using a handful of river sand as primitive soap, I scrubbed away pottage splatters and sweat. Nearby, a pair of geese honked indignantly as I scattered stray crumbs into the current. I'd read that such rural streams often carried parasites, but a good scrub and a rapid retreat upstream usually sufficed. Clothed once more, I headed toward the communal pens, where woolly sheep huddled against a low fence. A shepherd boy, maybe 10 years old, was tossing hay into troughs. He paused to stare at me, slack-jawed. "You're not from round here, are you?" he asked in a voice that blended curiosity with suspicion. I shrugged, offering him a crust from my bread, a gesture of peace. His eyes lit up as he accepted it, crumbling the bread into the trough for the sheep. I noted how vital livestock were: sheep for wool and mutton, goats for milk, and pigs, when villagers could spare the scant scraps fattened on household waste. A single pig might feed a family for weeks, making it both a manure producer and a portable pantry. The shepherd boy explained that wool was sheared only once a year, usually in May, when the sheep grew unbearably itchy. Between seasons, villagers repaired their own garments with every scrap of usable cloth. Next, I ventured to the apothecary's hut, a modest wattle structure festooned with bundles of mugwort and dried elderflowers. Inside the apothecary, a stooped woman with silver-streaked hair stirred a cauldron of simmering herbs. "Good afternoon," I greeted, wincing as the aroma of bruised mint and chamomile washed over me. She peered at my braid of notes dangling from my belt and chuckled. A curious traveler, I come to learn the secrets of folk remedies. She showed me how to crush willow bark for pain relief, an early aspirin of sorts, and how to blend comfrey poultices to staunch bleeding. Her explanations were part science, part superstition, a pinch of mistletoe for cheer, and a dab of honey in a wound to invite sweet spirits. I recorded each step, marveling at how necessity bred these prescriptions long before laboratories and microscopes. By late afternoon, the sun dipped toward the western hills. Animals bleated in anticipation of evening feed, and the apothecary's cauldron cooled to a murmur. I tucked away my quill, aware that supper preparations and the village's evening prayers awaited. Each step drawing me deeper into this rugged tapestry of daily medieval life. By the time I returned to the tavern just before dusk, the sky had softened to lavender. Smoke curled from every chimney, painting the air in sepia tones. Within, the hearth crackled beneath a blackened cauldron, simmering with something more enticing than the morning's pottage: a stew of root vegetables, dried peas, and occasional morsels of salted pork. The innkeeper glanced up as I entered, his apron streaked with grease. "Evening meal, scholar," he grunted, sliding a wooden platter toward me. Torches flickered along the walls, casting dancing shadows on roughly hewn benches. Families clustered over their steaming bowls, fingers sticky with broth. A child jabbed at a slice of coarse oatcake, mumbling that it tastes like barley's cousin, twice removed. I found this oddly comforting. Some complaints never change. While I spooned stew into my mouth, the innkeeper offered a horn of ale. Taverns dispensed ale by gravity, each vessel differing wildly in flavor and strength. Mid-bite, a troop of villagers rose as the church bell tolled once more for vespers. Lanterns in hand, they filed outside onto the muddy street. The Lord's steward had arrived with a small retinue, announcing a summons to meet in the churchyard. Curiosity prickled me. Rarely did commoners gather at the behest of nobility, unless taxes, or worse, were on the agenda. In the crisp evening air, I followed the crowd to the stone church, its aged walls etched with moss. Flickering lanterns revealed villagers whispering about the Lord's planned harvest levy, a mandatory tithe of 1/10 of all produce. A stout farmer grumbled that this year's yields were thin. Another widow feared she'd lose her only sack of grain. The steward's voice boomed as he reminded everyone of the penalty for shortfall, an extra half share seized without mercy. I scribbled furiously, noting how feudal obligations bound every aspect of peasant life. Freedom, in their world, meant merely avoiding outright starvation and surviving the Lord's whims. Yet, despite the weight of authority, I heard laughter, too. A bold young baker teasing his sweetheart about burning the levy records, and an elderly weaver joking that she'd hide her flax under her skirts. As the assembly dispersed, lanterns bobbing like fireflies, I lingered to watch a group of children chase one another around the church's buttresses, reminders that even in hardship, joy found a way. The moon had risen by the time I trudged back to my straw pallet, the tavern's glow receding behind me. Tomorrow promised its own grind, dawn's chores, the Lord's overseer, and more remedies from the apothecary. Yet, for now, I allowed myself a contented nod, thrilled and humbled to bear witness as history breathed round me. After the steward's lantern-lit procession dispersed, I retraced my steps through the village lanes, each house dark except for a single flickering candle in the window, a beacon against prowling wolves and, presumably, drunks. The air had cooled sharply, and I pulled my woolen cloak tighter. In the waning light, every stone wall and crooked roofline looked like part of a grand tapestry, stitched with grit and ingenuity. Reaching my lodging modest lean-to, tacked on to the tavern's rear, I ducked under the low lintel. Inside, the hearth coals still glowed faintly beneath a layer of ash. A battered earthenware chamber pot sat in the corner, unspeakably necessary but never a subject of polite conversation. I lit a rushlight placed in a clay holder. Its sputtering flame cast elongated shadows that danced across the rough plaster walls. Curiosity led me to inspect my bed, a simple pallet of straw sacks sewn together, covered by a patchwork blanket of coarse wool scraps. Decades of mending had left visible stitches, each a testament to frugality and resourcefulness. I crawled in, the mattress crunching beneath me like a sack of dried peas. Already, I could feel the familiar itch of straw and the imminent arrival of tiny hitchhikers, known in medieval lore as bedbugs or wopweeds. Modern travelers carry comforting hypoallergenic pillows. Here, the only certainty was an uneven surface and the possibility of nocturnal bites. I propped my notebook on my knees, lantern flame wavering. Reflections of the day paraded through my mind. The rhythmic clang of the forge, the hush of the apothecary's herbs, the farmer's grumbles over the tithe. How remarkable that people adapted to such harsh conditions, crafting tools without mass production, preserving food without refrigeration, and treating ailments without antibiotics. Each innovation sprang from necessity, crop rotation to replenish soil, baptismal fonts to welcome infants into a world where infant mortality neared 30%, and guilds to regulate trades, ensuring apprentices learned from masters before earning their own livelihoods. A faint sound reached my ears, a nightingale's distant trill, improbably melodious in the stillness. It reminded me that even amid toil and scarcity, nature offered its own lullaby. A dog barked once, someone snored gently in the next room, and the cowl of barn owls swept overhead. All these small details would disappear in modern printouts and digital archives. Here, I captured them in real time, living history one heartbeat at a time. Setting aside my quill, I stretched under the blanket's comforting weight. Tomorrow's dawn would bring chores again, feeding chickens, hauling water, perhaps witnessing a woodcutter's demonstration of the two-man saw. But for now, I allowed myself a final, dry chuckle at the thought of my 21st century comforts: running water, electric lights, and mattresses that claimed to be orthopedic. Here, sleep promised to be deeper, albeit punctuated by fleas and creaking beams. Closing my eyes, I whispered a mental note: document the sleepers, rest and the dreams that come to those who survive another medieval night. With that, the cathedral of stars outside my window faded, and I drifted into the past's embrace, ready to wake again and record history's unvarnished truths. At first light, just as a rosy glow crept over the rolling fields, I stirred beneath my scratchy wool blanket. The lean-to's straw pallet had compressed overnight into a lumpy cradle, but I welcomed the ache in my back as proof of another night survived. Outside, the chant of barnyard roosters heralded the start of a new day's toil. I dressed in yesterday's tunic, now air-dried on a peg, and slipped through the tavern's back door into the chill morning air. A dense mist clung to the ground, each blade of grass bristling with dew. The smell of burning peat rose from hearths in neighboring huts, fuel more common than wood in damp climates where forests were guarded jealously by the Lord. My first task: help Mary, the widow who owned the village's only goat, milk her morning yield. We crouched beside the stoic animal in a straw-strewn shed. Mary pressed the warm teats between practiced fingers, coaxing rich white milk into a wooden pail. "Keep it quick, or she kicks," she warned with a wry smile. I mimicked her movements, splashing more on the floor than in the bucket, but she laughed kindly and guided my fingers until warm liquid splattered neatly. With 2 pints of milk secured, I trudged toward the communal bakehouse at the edge of the green. Here, villagers queued with loaves of unbaked dough, mine included, shaped yesterday and left to rise on cloth-lined boards. The baker, a barrel-chested man named Johannes, hefted a wooden peel to slide bread into a brick oven fired by oak logs. "Needs a skin like a soldier's cuirass," he said, referring to the ideal crust. Flames licked the cavernous interior, and the air shimmered with heat and the promise of fresh bread. While the loaves baked, I observed how cooperation underpinned survival. No single peasant could maintain an oven. Its upkeep required shared wood and communal labor. The baker managed the fire's temperature by reading the color of embers, a skill passed down through generations long before thermometers existed. As golden loaves emerged, crust crackling like distant thunder, I tucked a warm wedge under my cloak for later. The sun had climbed further, and soon I would head to the manor's scribe, eager to see how records of tithes and tenants were kept. But for now, the simple pleasure of fresh bread and the chorus of morning life reminded me Even in this austere world, human ingenuity and generosity flourished in every shared task. By mid-morning, the sun had fully burned away the mist, turning the village green into a patchwork of gold and emerald. Clutching my warm wedge of bread, I set off toward the manor house, a two-story timber-framed building that loomed over the cottages like a silent overseer. Its walls were whitewashed with lime, and narrow windows, inset with oiled parchment, glowed faintly from the hearths within. Inside the entrance hall, I announced myself, a ritual of 3 polite bows learned from yesterday's overheard tutelage, and the steward, a lean man named Ulrich, led me down a low-ceilinged corridor to the scribe's chamber. Wooden desks lined the walls, each littered with quills, inkpots of nicked clay, and piles of parchment rolled and tied with leather thongs. "Welcome, scholar," the scribe said, without looking up. His spectacles, a rarity made of polished horn, perched precariously on his nose. With a flourish, he scooped a heap of wax-shingled letters from a corner desk. "The Lord's correspondence keeps me busier than a bee in clover." I watched as he dipped a quill into jet-black ink made from oak galls and iron salts. Each letter he copied required scribes to sit motionless for hours, the candles flicker, reflecting in their weary eyes. No printing presses here. Every copy was handcrafted. Literacy was prized, but scarce. Only clergy, nobility, and a handful of merchants could decode these looping scripts. Ulrich peered over my shoulder. "You understand Latin?" he asked. Though Latin was the language of church and governance, villagers spoke a ragtag dialect of Old English peppered with Norman French. I shook my head, admitting I relied on strong intuition and my growing list of key phrases. He chuckled, then translated one letter aloud. "Your Grace, the shipment of wool has arrived at Southampton, and the customs dues are overdue." His tone was dry, as though reading grocery prices, yet this correspondence bound England to continental markets, reminding me that even our remote village was a single thread in a vast economic tapestry. Before I left, Ulrich showed me the manor's rolling account scrolls, ledgers that tallied tithes, fines, and payments in silver pennies. Margins bore annotations in shorthand: 2 sheep lost to wolf, or +3 bushels of barley. It struck me how meticulously these balances were kept, for a kingdom's power depended on knowing every coin's origin. Stepping back into daylight, I crunched along the pebbled courtyard, savoring my bread's flaky crust. The manor's records offered a glimpse of the medieval world's administrative might, no small feat given the era's lack of decimal points or calculators. As I tucked my notes away, I realized that tomorrow's journey would take me to the field edges to watch crop rotation firsthand. Another chapter of life here awaited, each day revealing new ingenuity born of necessity. By late morning, I found myself trudging down a narrow cart track toward the village's patchwork fields. Each strip, called a cellion, stretched between earthen ridges, the boundaries reinforced by packed turf raised like miniature levees. A cool breeze rustled the wheat's green shoots, promising a golden harvest in late summer. I greeted a group of villagers bent over the soil, men and women weeding with iron hoes and sharp spades. "Good day," I ventured. The oldest among them, Mistress Alfwyn, straightened and wiped her brow, revealing a face etched by wind and sun. "Ah, a stranger taking the air," she observed, peering at my unfamiliar garb. "Are the come to learn about our 3-field system?" I nodded eagerly. she beckoned me closer. "See here," she said, pointing to 3 adjacent strips. The first bore a fresh crop of barley, fine and lush. The second sprouted peas and beans, legumes to restore the earth's nitrogen. The third lay fallow, its furrows turned under to rest. Each year we rotate, grain, pulse, then rest. The soil breathes and yields improve. Without this practice, fields would soon tire and give us nothing but weeds. I knelt to inspect the furrow's dark earth, rich with decaying plant matter. I recalled modern farmers' use of synthetic fertilizers, advanced yet dependent on industrial processes. Here, villagers relied on centuries-old observation, gleaned through trial and error, a mutual contract between people and their land. As Alfwin and her companions worked, they chatted about a coming storm, an April tempest, they muttered, followed by laughter, recalling last year's downpour that washed away half a wheat crop. Rain was both boon and bane, necessary for growth, yet capable of turning footpaths into mud swamps and flooding low-lying cottages. Nearby, a shepherd guided sheep into a stubble field, letting them graze on leftover chaff and naturally fertilize the soil with their droppings. This integrated system astonished me with its elegance. Animals, plants, and people each played their part in a self-sustaining cycle. Before departing, I offered Alfwin a sip of water from my canteen, a luxury I carried from the future. She accepted gratefully, remarking that clean water was prized and shared freely only in good years. As I walked back toward the manor road, notebook brimming with sketches of furrows and sheep paths, I marveled at how medieval agriculture combined observation, communal effort, and subtle humor. For even as they worked, one young farmhand sang a bawdy tune about a lazy goose that wouldn't stir a feather without a hefty bribe. Even in the fields, life here formed a tapestry woven with resilience and laughter. Returning from the fields, I paused at the village fountain, a circular stone basin fed by a clay pipe from an upstream spring. Villagers cupped their hands to drink, refilling wooden barrels for cooking and washing. I knelt, sipping cool water that tasted faintly of limestone and moss. Nearby, a chatter of children splashed in shallow troughs, their laughter ringing like bells. Across the way stood the tanner's yard, stinking of lime pits and curing hides. The tanner himself, a broad-shouldered fellow named Bertram, wore a patched leather apron and wielded a fleshing knife with ease. He beckoned me over, curious about where your boots came from. He grinned, raising an eyebrow. He demonstrated how raw animal skins, soaked first in lime to loosen hair, were scraped clean, stretched on frames, then dipped in tannin-rich oak bark baths. The result, supple leather for shoes, belts, and shields. The stink's dreadful, Bertram admitted, but hides are worth their weight in silver once cured. He paused, sniffing the air. My wife makes me keep the door closed, lest the whole village protest. His humor was as rich as the vats of bark beneath him. I noted how tanners often lived on the outskirts, both for space and because their trade offended more delicate noses. Watching the process, I realized that leatherworking required not only physical strength, but a knowledge of chemistry long before the term existed. The tannins in bark bind proteins in the skin, preventing decay. No medieval university taught this explicitly. Instead, tanners learned through apprenticeships, handed down generation after generation. As the sun reached its zenith, villagers drifted toward shade beneath the yew tree by the churchyard or inside the cool stone walls of the chapel. I followed suit, sitting on a worn bench to nibble on my remaining wedge of yesterday's bread, slathered with a smear of goat cheese. A group of women gathered to spin wool, their painstaking rhythms turning fleece into thread. Their fingers moved deftly, tugging locks of white fleece through a spindle's whirl, a sight so peaceful it might lull one to sleep, if not for the consistency of their commentary about the upcoming harvest festival. By the time I rose, the tannery stench had waned under a breeze, and the village hummed with preparation for the evening. My notebook was half filled, sketches of tanning vats, diagrams of the three-field rotation, and quotes from villagers on the virtues of fresh leather. With midday chores done, I set my sights on the blacksmith's demonstration at the forge, eager to see metal shaped once more under hammer and anvil. Another tapestry thread awaited me in this living chronicle of medieval life. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the forge yard as I approached once more, drawn by the rhythmic clang that punctuated the village's steady heartbeat. The blacksmith's anvil, glowing red-hot from earlier work, now sat cool, its owner occupied with finishing last week's horseshoes. Sparks still clung to his suit-darkened trousers like fiery fireflies reluctant to go home. Just in time, the blacksmith called, wiping sweat and scale from his brow with a leather forearm guard. "Come see how to temper steel." He heated a slender blade until it blazed orange, then plunged it into a trough of oil. The hiss was deafening, steam swirling above the barrel. I leaned back, half expecting a dragon to emerge, only to see Bertram's apprentice scrubbing the blade's edge with a rag. "Why oil and not water?" I asked, recalling extinguishing my campfire last summer. "Water's too violent," the blacksmith explained, tugging the blade free. "It cools unevenly, cracking the steel. Oil's gentler, gives a better edge, like a calm neighbor who helps you move, but won't take your sofa." I jotted down the analogy, admiring both his craftsmanship and his humor. Next door, the wheelwright, an elderly man with silver hair and keen eyes, was inspecting a freshly assembled wheel. Each spoke radiated from the hub like the sun's rays, the outer rim perfectly circular. He invited me to turn it. The wheel rolled smoothly on a nearby axle, its iron tire clamped tight against the wood. "Wheels are the backbone of transport," he said, tracing a finger along a carefully chamfered spoke. "Without them, carts stick in mud like sheep in brambles." His apprentice nodded solemnly, though I suspected he'd tripped over a cart tongue earlier that morning. The wheelwright explained how green wood from ash trees was split and shaped, left to season for months before assembly, an exercise in patience that contrasted with the blacksmith's fiery urgency. As the bell in the forge tower tolled the hour, villagers paused in their tasks to lift eyes skyward. It was time for meal of peace, when guild members and laborers gathered at their workshops to share a simple supper. Inside the forge, benches ran along the walls, and wooden platters of smoked fish and barley cakes awaited. A shared loaf, fresh from morning's bake, passed hand to hand, the crust still warm despite the day's heat. I joined the wheelwright and blacksmith, nibbling on salty fish and sopping broth with cake crumbs. Conversation drifted from tool talk to tales of last year's fair in the next shire, a rare event where exotic goods from distant towns appeared, along with jonglers and jesters. Even here, on a remote village edge, news traveled on the tongues of travelers and traders. By the time I rose to depart, the forge's glow had softened with embers, and the wheelwright's apprentice was already scheming tomorrow's apprenticeships. My notes brimmed with details, tempering temperatures, the geometry of spokes, and the social glue of shared meals. Each revelation wove new texture into my understanding of medieval life, a world forged in fire, patience, and communal bonds. As I stepped into the golden dusk, I felt that the village itself was alive, its pulse matching the steady beats of hammer and wheel. As twilight deepened into purple dusk, villagers began gathering once more by the church's sturdy oak door. The bell tolled for second vespers, its sound mellow now, guiding worn hands to clasp in prayer. Inside the dimly lit nave, incense coils smoldered beneath painted wooden beams. Fathers held toddlers on their hips. Grandmothers closed their eyes, lips moving in hushed Latin, phrases taught by priest and family alike. I slipped into a shadowed corner, notebook tucked in my cloak, and observed how faith wove itself into daily rhythm, a comfort, a stern authority, and a reminder of life beyond these muddy lanes. After vespers, torchbearers assembled for the night watch, led by the constable, a gaunt man named Oswin. They marched in 2 rows around the village perimeter, drums announcing each passing hour, all's well. They called at each checkpoint, voices echoing under the star-bright sky. The night watch served dual purposes, deterring thieves and alerting against fire, for thatched roofs could ignite in an instant. I nodded to Oswin, who gripped a pike tipped with iron, a reminder that even routine safety required vigilance and stout hearts. While the watch patrolled, I strolled toward the village pond, its still surface reflecting torches like scattered stars. A few fishermen, nets coiled at their feet, whispered about tomorrow's catch, pike, perch, and the occasional carp. Fish provided protein few could afford more often than once a week. Hence, catching and preserving them in salt or smoke was crucial. I crouched at the water's edge, dipping a finger to taste its cool sweetness, and marveled at how each villager played a part. The fisher's patience balanced the miller's grind and the baker's crust. By the pond, a group of young apprentices lounged against a fallen oak, sharing tales of apprenticeships under blacksmiths, tanners, and weavers. One boasted of mastering the spinning wheel's tricky flyer. Another winked that he'd pranked his master's molds with an extra horseshoe shape, an irreverent joke destined to become local legend. Their laughter floated over the reeds, a melody undampened by broomcorn shadows. Realizing the hour had grown late, I retraced my steps through lantern-lit lanes. My straw pallet awaited, and with it the promise of sleep, fleas and all. Yet, as I curled beneath the blanket, I felt richer for the day's discoveries, a world bound by faith, duty, and communal care, all sustained by knowledge, passed hand to hand, generation to generation, with the distant night watch still calling all's well. I closed my eyes, content that tomorrow's dawn would offer fresh chapters in this living medieval chronicle. When the first tendrils of dawn crept through the narrow slits in the tavern's wall, I awoke to a distant roar, less a natural sound than the promise of industry. Slipping on my worn tunic, I stepped into the crisp morning and followed the noise toward the riverbank, where the village mill stood astride a wooden sluice gate. The miller, Master Godric, was already at work, guiding water through the gate to turn a massive overshot wheel. Each revolution creaked with ancient weight, transmitting power via a series of gears to the stone runner above. Flour dust hung in the golden air as Godric lifted sacks of freshly ground meal from the chute. "Good morning, scholar," he called over the roar, his voice as sturdy as the timber beams overhead. Come see how power flows from water, not beasts, and grinds our wheat. I ducked inside the mill's shadowy interior, where shafts of light pierced the dust. Godric demonstrated how grain poured from bins into the eye of the millstone, which spun at precise spacing to crush kernels into fine flour, essential for the daily bread that sustained the village. Without this wheel, he said, gesturing at the huge mechanism, we'd return to grinding by hand. 2 hours of elbow grease for a loaf. He tapped the wheel's wooden paddles, each carved to catch water efficiently. The overshot design, in which water courses over the top, exploited gravity for maximum torque, an engineering triumph centuries old. A youthful apprentice, wiping sweat from her brow, joined us. I learned to maintain the wheel's trough, clearing stones and moss so the flow stays smooth, she explained. She paused, then added with a grin, though sometimes I worry I'll end up as the first victuals if I slip into the sluice. The miller chuckled, reminding her that the trough was shallow enough to avoid tragedy. Though a soggy apprentice was no rarity. Outside, sacks of grain awaited transport to the bakehouse. I noted the neat system, marked bags for wheat, rye, and barley, each stamped with the farmer's personal seal. This ensured accountability. No nobleman's grain ever went missing on my watch, the steward had warned yesterday. I jotted diagrams of the overshot wheel and the path of water through the sluice, conscious of how watermills here catalyzed medieval economies long before steam engines or fossil fuels. Before departing, I filled a small pouch with coarse middlings, the nutrient-rich bits sifted out of flour to take to the pigs later. As I walked back through the dew-soaked meadow toward the village green, I reflected on how the mill represented both communal investment and technological ingenuity. In this world, every tool, from the blacksmith's hammer to the miller's wheel, was a testament to human creativity, harnessed to meet the relentless demands of survival. With the morning's industrial symphony still echoing, I prepared to chart the day's next adventure, visiting the pondside dyer, who would show me how vivid cloth colors bloomed without modern chemistry, another thread in this rich tapestry of medieval life. By mid-morning, the sun's warmth coaxed the mist from the pond, revealing reeds shimmering with dew. I made my way to the dyer's hut, a modest wooden structure festooned with swaths of cloth in muted greens and grays. Inside, a stout woman named Sibylla stood over iron vats, simmering with plant brews, her fingers stained with hues no modern finger paint could match. "Welcome to my alchemical workshop," she announced, lifting a length of woolen cloth from a vat of welled flowers. The fabric, once a dull off-white, now glowed lemon-bright. She rinsed it in a trough of clear water, then draped it on a rack by the window to dry. "Weld gives us yellow, madder root, red, woad, blue. Mix them carefully and you get greens, nature's own palette." I leaned close to inhale the sweet sour aroma of simmered roots. Sibylla explained mordants, substances like alum or tannin that fixed dyes to fibers. Without them, she cautioned, color would wash out in the next rain. Her apprentice, a keen-eyed youth, passed her a basket of oak galls for ink making and a handful of crushed cochineal insects for scarlet dye, an expensive import from southern lands. As I sketched her process, Sibylla recounted how vibrant cloth signaled status. Peasants wore undyed browns and grays, while merchants and minor nobility adorned themselves in bright colors, subject to sumptuary laws meant to preserve social order. A beggar in purple might find himself in the stocks, she winked. Fashion still carries weight, even when pepper costs more than a sheep. Suddenly, a low rumble rolled across the fields. Dark clouds gathered above the pond, and Sibylla's apprentice dashed outside, clutching a length of cloth he'd left to dry. The thunder cracked sharply, far closer than anticipated. Villagers emerged from their workshops, eyes skyward, as a gust snapped cloth from drying racks and sent it cartwheeling into the reeds. "Quickly now," Sibylla barked, grabbing the dew-soaked cloth. We all raced in a flurry of arms, chasing colors in the wind. I stumbled over a basket of empty dye vats, sending it clattering across the yard. Laughter bubbled up despite the looming storm, an unexpected moment of shared exhilaration. Within minutes, the dyer's yard was secured. Cloth lashed to racks, pots sheltered under tarps, and apprentices scrubbing mud from their knees. The rain began in earnest, drumming on the hut's thatch like 1,000 impatient fingers. Inside, Sibylla brewed a fresh pot of chamomile tea, insisting we warm our hands and our spirits before returning to work. As I sipped the fragrant infusion, I noted how even a sudden thunderstorm could unite a community in purpose and humor. In this medieval village, life's unpredictability was woven into every task, every dye vat, and every bolt of cloth, just as much as the stout oak beams overhead. And with that, my chronicle of a single day in medieval life grew richer still. When the rain finally tapered to a gentle patter, I emerged from the dyer's hut into a world washed clean. The air smelled of damp earth and crushed wildflowers, the colors of Sibylla's cloth now deeper where moisture clung. Villagers scurried about, nailing loose thatch, baling pooled water from cart tracks, and retying laundry to sturdier lines. I paused to help secure a trembling rack with a length of rope, recognizing yet again how communal effort turned calamity into camaraderie. Across the green, I spotted the blacksmith's apprentice trotting toward the forge with a soaked apprentice's smock dripping from his arm. He offered an embarrassed grin as he shook the garment like a bedraggled bird. Storm came up quicker than kneading dough, he joked, and I laughed, knowing that humor was the village's sixth sense. As afternoon edged toward evening, a new sound fluttered on the breeze, the twang of a lute and the lilting voice of a traveling minstrel. I followed the melody to the tavern's yard, where a slender man in patchwork, motley, perched on a barrel, his hat adorned with a single pheasant feather. Villagers gathered, curious eyes bright under torchlight, as he launched into a ballad of Robin Hood, though his lyrics blended fact and fiction in ways that made ears perk. "Gentlefolk, lend me your ears," he announced between verses. "Did you know that the first ballads were sung to warn of tax collectors? Hide your pence or lose your stitch." He struck a humorous chord. Peasants groaned at the memory of yesterday's tithe summons, but smiled at the minstrelsy's playful spin. Children clustered at the front, wide-eyed, as he mimed arrow flights and danced a jig, while elders tapped their feet and banged tankards in time. Intrigued, I approached him afterward. "Your tale weaves truth and fancy well," I remarked. He tilted his lute case respectfully. "We minstrels survive by invention, good sir. A kernel of fact makes the kernel of truth, but a froth of whimsy makes the tale memorable." He plucked a single string thoughtfully. "Stories bind communities, telling of past deeds, teaching lessons, and stirring hearts. No small task, but one fit for any chronicler." I thanked him, mentally adding minstrel's perspective on oral history to my notes. His presence reminded me that literacy and parchment were not the only vehicles for memory. Songs, poetry, and performance carried a village's soul. As twilight dimmed into night, the minstrel packed his lute and slipped away toward the manor gates, ready for the next hamlet's hearth. Walking back to my lean-to, I replayed fragments of his ballad, stories of outlaws and lawmen, generosity and guile. In a world bound by daily labor, it was the spark of creativity, song, story, dance, that illuminated routine and forged shared identity. With that thought warming me more than the thick wool blanket ever could, I finally settled into sleep's embrace, eager for tomorrow's dawn and the new chronicles it would bring. The next dawn found the village market square already alive with activity. I stepped into a mosaic of stalls, barrels of pickled vegetables glinting in the sun, baskets brimming with apples still pale from the morning dew, and a scattering of spices, peppercorns, and saffron, brought by itinerant traders from distant towns. The air tasted of commerce, haggling voices, scuffed boots on cobbles, and the occasional bray of a tethered donkey. At the center of the square stood a tall, cloaked stranger I hadn't seen before. His stall offered a curious array of goods: polished obsidian mirrors, lengths of silk woven with gold thread, and glass beads as translucent as drops of morning fog. A knot of villagers clustered, marveling at wares normally beyond their purse. I edged closer as he meticulously arranged each object on an oiled cloth. "Good morrow," I called, adjusting my tunic to appear scholarly but not overly wealthy. He looked up, revealing a weathered face framed by salt and pepper hair. "You have rare wares," I observed. He smiled, baring teeth stained faintly green, evidence of betel nut or local herbs. "Imported from far Cathay," he replied, solving the day's geography lesson. Trade routes stretched from China to these humble fields, carrying silks and spices in caravans that braved bandits and sandstorms. A curious child tugged at a glass bead, its facet catching sunlight like a tiny star. The trader scooped it up gently. "This came by ship around the Cape of Good Hope, then by river barge to here," he explained. "Each bead traveled more than you ever have." Murmurs of astonishment rippled through onlookers. Their world, they realized, was far less isolated than they believed. Nearby, a poultry farmer offered me a battered hen in exchange for a handful of peppercorns. Pepper was so prized it doubled as currency in some regions. I shook my head politely. Peppercorns were too valuable to barter for one plump bird when a meal of pottage and bread sufficed. The farmer shrugged and sold her hen instead to a baker who planned to roast it in his hearth oven at the next festival. Suddenly, a hawk, its wingtip brushing the stall's awning, swooped low across the square, talons outstretched toward a guinea fowl tethered nearby. The bird squawked in terror as the hawk missed its mark, skimming past traders' heads before spiraling upward. A collective gasp rose, followed by laughter at the near miss. The hawk, likely hunting mice, stirred by the market's bustle, flapped away across plowed fields. The guinea fowl huddled, feathers ruffled but unharmed. As calm returned, the stranger wrapped his wares, inviting me to handle a piece of hammered bronze jewelry decorated with filigree. "The Romans used similar techniques," he said, his tone shifting to a quiet lesson. "Even long after Rome's fall, artisans preserved their craft in monasteries and workshops." I traced the delicate spirals with a careful fingertip, marveling at how ancient methods endured through the centuries. With a final nod, I left the stall richer for the traders' stories, and reminded that even in a remote medieval hamlet, the currents of global exchange and natural drama, hawks, trade, and distant echoes of empires, wove into daily life. Clutching my growing notes, I prepared for the afternoon's journey to the nearby woodlands, where charcoal burners would reveal yet another facet of this vibrant world. By early afternoon, I traded village bustle for the hush of ancient oaks and beeches. A narrow path wound into the woodland, carpeted with moss and punctuated by shafts of sunlight. The air smelled of pine, resin, and damp earth, worlds away from hearth smoke and mannerless lanes. My destination, a charcoal burner's site, set beside a clear spring where woodworkers drew cool water for their thirsty toil. I soon heard the soft hiss of smoldering embers and rounded a bend to reveal a towering dome of turf-covered logs. An earth-clad kill, beside it, a gaunt man named Renard, his forearms streaked with soot, prodded a small vent hole with a green hazel stick. "Good day, traveler," he greeted, voice low as the kilns rumble. "Come to learn how we turn wood to black gold." I nodded, stepping closer as he squatted beside the kiln's earthen flank. "Charcoal fuels forge and kitchen alike," he explained, brushing ash from his cloak. "Burning oak or beech in loxygen conditions strips water and volatile compounds, leaving pure carbon, hotter, cleaner, and lighter than raw wood." He beckoned me to peer into one of several vents. Through the gloom, orange glows pulsed like distant embers of a dragon's forge. "Balance is everything," Renard said, poking the vent just enough to let a whisper of air feed the fire. "Too much, and you get ash. Too little, and the wood won't char fully." He gestured at the surrounding piles of split logs. Birch for quick burns, oak for slow, enduring coals. Each species yielded charcoal of different qualities. Knowledge farmers and smiths paid him handsomely for the right blend. As he spoke, a sudden rustle in the undergrowth startled us both. A young wild boar, its bristly coat mud-spattered, burst from the ferns and charged toward the kilden's heat, maybe drawn by warmth or the scent of roasting wood. Renard leaped up, brandishing a stout walking stick. "Shoo," he barked, but the boar sniffed around, searching for the spring. I scrambled to help, tossing a bit of dried bracken to guide it back into the woods. With a final disgruntled grunt, it scuttled away, leaving us laughing at our woodland surprise. Once the kill settled, Renard shaved a twig from his mantle and offered me a sliver of fresh charcoal as token. "A medieval souvenir," he quipped. I tucked it into my pouch, marveling at how this simple process fueled every forge, oven, and hearth for miles. With the kiln's hiss still echoing, I retraced my steps toward the village, mind buzzing with chemical wonders, woodland wildlife, and the unexpected excitement that lurked beneath the forest's quiet canopy. By late afternoon, the sun slanted low through the trees as I made my way back toward the village, sandal straps coated in woodland clay. As I emerged from the shade, the sweet temps of hay and livestock greeted me, reminding me that another set of chores awaited before dusk's final prayers. Near the communal pen, Farmer Roland wrestled with a frantic calf that had slipped its rope and bolted across the green. Its large, liquid eyes darted between escape routes, hooves skidding in the muck. Roland, a burly man with a voice like rolling thunder, called out, "Easy now, Bess, no need for a sprint." He lunged, wrapping a rope around the calf's neck to steady it. A small crowd gathered, amused, as the calf made a half-hearted leap before Roland gently restrained her. Calves learn quick, Roland sighed, scrubbing sweat from his forehead, but they also test your patience. A young girl, Roland's daughter, stepped forward with a bucket of warm water and a handful of barley, coaxing the calf to calm with soft words. I observed how livestock management here required both muscle and empathy. Lessons passed father to child, year by year. As the pen settled into peaceful bleating, Roland turned to me. You've seen charcoal burners and tanners. Care to try milking a cow? Before I could protest, he led me to a gentle brindle cow tied to a post, just like goats, but bigger, he joked. I knelt beside her massive flank, mimicking the Widow Mary's motions from days before. Warm milk dripped into the wooden pail with a reassuring rhythm. Well done, Roland praised, when I managed a full half pint without so much as a drop on the ground. Meanwhile, the village smith's hammer rang out across the green as the blacksmith finished horseshoes for the Lord's retinue. The wheelwright's apprentice wheeled a finished cartwheel down the lane, its polished surface gleaming. Every clang and creak reminded me how each specialized craft tied into daily survival. As shadows lengthened, I tucked the calf's adventure and my bovine debut into my notes. The call to vespers would soon echo again. But first I paused to watch a pair of swans glide along the pond's mirrored surface, a serene contrast to the earlier calf commotion. In this village, from forest to field to forge, every moment brimmed with life's unexpected turns and the timeless dance between human and animal, labor and laughter. As the sky deepened to indigo, I found myself drawn not to vespers, but to a makeshift tent pitched beside the churchyard wall. Lanterns swung in the evening breeze, illuminating a traveling physician's stall, an unusual sight in our remote village. Dr. Osborne, a lean man in a patched hood, beckoned me forward. Curious about medieval medicine, he asked, brandishing a small bronze cup. Inside the tent, he demonstrated cupping therapy. Heated cups pressed to a volunteer's back, creating suction to draw out humors. The volunteer, a sturdy farmer who'd slipped while herding sheep, grimaced as red rings bloomed on his skin. Osborne explained that medieval medicine still relied on Galens for humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Balance these, he said, and health follows imbalance, and you catch fever or worse. I noted how this framework dominated treatments long before germ theory, shaping prescriptions of bloodletting with leeches or purgatives of rue and senna. Curiosity satisfied, I slipped away as villagers whispered about tomorrow's snow warning. An early frost could spell disaster for late-planted grains. The church bell tolled vespers then, its low note rippling across the green. Inside the nave, candlelight revealed frescoed saints whose painted eyes seemed to watch over every bowed head. Emerging into the crisp evening, I headed for the tavern, where tables of oiled boards bore plates of venison stew and pots of mead. A minstrel, perhaps the same one from days past, sat in the corner, plucking a gentle tune on his psaltery. His melody wove around the aroma of roasting meat, a lullaby both hearty and hopeful. As I dined, a scruffy stray dog slipped between benches, nose twitching at every dropped crumb. No one shooed him. Instead, an old woman slid a bit of bread to him under the table, proof that compassion extended beyond humans. The dog wolfed it down, then settled at my feet with a grateful wag. Between mouthfuls, I struck up conversation with the innkeeper's daughter, who confessed she dreamed of becoming a scribe someday. if only my hands weren't so busy with hearth and hall. Her ambition reminded me that dreams persisted even in the thrall of daily survival. By the time I left, the tavern's fire had burned low, embers glowing like embers of hope against the coming night. Above, winter's first stars pricked the sky. My calloused straw pallet awaited, and with it the promise that tomorrow I'd rise again, ready to record each facet of this community's resilience, ingenuity, and unexpected warmth under an ancient, ever-turning world. A thin veil of frost glittered across the village green when I awoke the following morning. Each blade of grass sparkled like a field of diamonds beneath the pale sun, an enchanting sight, yet portentous. Early frost threatened tender shoots still clinging to life. I pulled on my wool cloak and stepped into the chill, noting how villagers already bustled about, stomping through the courtyard to clear ice from their doorsteps. My first stop was the mill, where Master Gotrek inspected his overshot wheel. A frost like this can choke the sluice if ice forms, he explained, rapping on the wooden trough with gloved knuckles. 2 apprentices fanned flames beneath the wheel's axle to keep it turning, while another lad chipped ice away with a curved hatchet. The teamwork reminded me that medieval industry depended not just on ingenious design, but on constant vigilance against nature's whims. As I scribbled these observations, a young rider clattered into the courtyard on a lean mare. He was the Lord's herald, bearing a letter sealed with crimson wax. Villagers paused their tasks to watch the scene. After all, dispatches were rare in this remote hamlet, and news from the manor carried weight. Godric called out, "What news travels so fast, lad?" The herald dismounted, breath steaming. "The king's tax collectors ride this way," he announced, unfolding the parchment. "All manors must prepare records for assessments, no exemptions." A hush fell, broken only by the steady drip of melting frost. I noted how this royal levy echoed the village's earlier tithe, yet reached deeper into every pocket. For peasants already wary of shortages, the prospect of additional burdens set hearts fluttering like geese startled by a hawk. As the herald remounted, a sudden clatter arose. One of the mill's trembling supports had snapped under frost stress, sending a chunk of ice crashing onto the wheelhouse roof. Apprentices shouted and cleared debris, while Gotrek barked orders to reinforce the beams with fresh oak timbers. Sparks flew from hastily drawn hatchets and ADSs, another demonstration of medieval ingenuity. Rapid repairs kept water power flowing without waiting for toolsmiths to arrive from distant towns. I helped haul a damp plank into place, muscles straining but spirit buoyed by communal solidarity. Even as royal demands loomed, the village rallied to preserve the mill's pulse, the very heart of daily life. With the wheel's steady turn restored, I tucked the herald's parchment into my satchel, keen to record how each dawn here brought new challenges, new lessons, and fresh proof that resilience, wit, and cooperation formed the very bedrock of medieval existence. By the time the sun reached its zenith, though through a veil of coal-gray clouds, it felt more like late autumn than early frost. I trudged toward the bakehouse, where the temperamental oven beckoned with promises of warmth and livelihood. A half-dozen villagers stood shivering beside its stone hearth, tossing on more peat to coax the temperature upward. "Bread's our lifeline," the baker, Aldred called, over the roar. His cheeks were ruddy from the oven's heat and the biting wind outside. No loaf, no strength, no strength, no work, and no work, no shelter. He offered me a pinch of rye dough to knead, its cold stickiness forcing my fingers to forget modern comforts like silicone spatulas. As I worked, he lectured on medieval flowers, impurities, bits of chaff that survived the stones, gritty husks that scraped teeth but provided stubborn fiber. Nearby, a scrawny dog nosed at spilled crumbs. His ribs showed where winter's hunger had thinned him to shadows of muscle. A villager tossed him a crust, and he wagged a tail so cautious it looked like a single feather trembling in wind. I couldn't help but think how every creature here struggled for scraps, and how easily a poor harvest could doom a family or a stray. As the oven's mouth glowed orange and loaves slid into its blazing throat, a sudden cough erupted from the chimney, louder than I'd ever heard from a thatch top. A fine shower of soot fluttered down, coating shoulders and dusting the floor like macabre snow. Cook's apron flew up as he ducked. Half-baked loaves tumbled in a greasy heap. Everyone froze, then burst into frantic motion. Rags waved to clear soot, buckets of cold water dashed over blazing embers, and a ladder rattled as apprentices hastened to inspect the flue. Within moments, the flare had been contained. A stubborn ember lodged in the thatch had ignited. The baker grabbed a hooked pole and swept it free, while 2 apprentices beat smoldering patches with wet mats. Outside, villagers formed a bucket line, passing water from the pond to the bakehouse roof. The teamwork was immediate. No time for formal muster or royal decree when flame and thatch flirted dangerously. As smoke cleared, Aldred straightened, face streaked in grime. "Just another day," he said wryly. "Better a soot scare than a snow-buried hearth." We laughed, dry humor rising against the chill. Yet beneath the levity lay truth. Life here was a contest against cold, hunger, and disaster at every turn. One spark in the wrong place, one failed crop, one missed payment could unravel weeks of toil. With the chimney singing only quiet murmurs now, the baker ladled thick porridge into wooden bowls and passed them out. I sipped the lukewarm gruel, barley, milk, and a dash of salt, enough to keep hunger at bay, but not to sat modern appetites. As I left the bakehouse, loaves wrapped under arm, my cloak dusted with soot, I reflected. In this medieval world, every bread crust, every labor-sharpened tool, and every bucket of water stood between survival and ruin, reminders that comfort in my own time came at the price of centuries' worth of hard-won ingenuity. Tomorrow promised more chores, more perils, and more discoveries of how astonishingly resilient and tenuous life truly was in the age before ease. After the morning's baking drama, my afternoon was earmarked for mending the village's wattle fence, a crucial barrier against wandering pigs and foxes bent on chicken raids. I joined 3 men heaving bundles of pliant hazel rods, weaving them tightly between upright stakes. The leader, an elderly fence-wright named Godwin, explained that willow and hazel were preferred for their flexibility. Once woven, the fence bound itself more tightly with each wind and rain, though rot meant a full rebuild every decade or so. "See these dog ears?" he asked, pointing to small triangular gaps at the base where earth met wood. They let mice slip through to the barn's straw, kept in check by the cats. Without them, nests spring up like spring's own crocuses. His dry grin acknowledged the quirks of medieval engineering. Nothing was wasted, and every hole had its purpose, just as I hammered the final hazel stake into the churned earth. A rumble came from above, but not like any thunder I'd heard. Within moments, Pale pellets pelted our heads and shoulders, hailstones no larger than peas, yet enough to sting bare skin and send us ducking for cover under the fence's scant shelter. Children darted from houses, shrieking in delight as they caught hail in their hands, evidence that even rough weather could spark innocent joy. When the storm passed as swiftly as it arrived, Godwin inspected the fence. Goodness from hardship, eh? He chuckled, brushing hailstones from his tunic. Better a bit of cold than a hungry fox. We resumed our work, the fence now sturdier for surviving nature's test. Later, word spread of a demonstration at the green. Master Shearer Athelstan was showcasing his spring shearing technique. I hurried over to find a docile sheep trust on its rump, wool thick as a mattress. Athelstan knelt, his long shears, two sharp blades joined at a fulcrum, glinting in sun and shade. With deft strokes, he peeled fleece from skin in wide spirals, leaving the sheep uninjured. Keep the blades flat, he advised a gawking apprentice, or you nick the wool, or worse, the creature. The apprentice's next cut was smooth, the fleece falling in one perfect blanket. Shearing was both art and necessity. Wool fetched good prices in market towns, fueling the textile trade that underpinned England's economy. I noted how each curl of fleece would be sorted by quality. Firsts for fine cloth, seconds for coarser garments, and thirds for rough blankets. As the final fleeces were tossed onto a collecting barrow, I tucked another entry into my notebook: fencecraft, hail surprises, and the ancient skill of shearing, all woven into the harsh yet marvel-filled tapestry of medieval life. With evening's vespers looming, I retraced my steps toward the lean-to, grateful to have witnessed once more the resilience and ingenuity that turned every challenge, whether wildlife or wear, into another opportunity for human adaptation. As dusk's golden rays softened the sky, I made my way to the village's makeshift archery range, an open patch of ground behind the manor's stables. Though the longbow would not yet be a soldier's staple, basic archery served both sport and pragmatism, hunting rabbits, dispatching pests, and practicing defense against raiders. A line of villagers stood behind a chalked line, each gripping a short wooden bow and a handful of arrows fletched with goose feathers. The instructor, an aging yeoman named Cedric, knocked an arrow to demonstrate the proper stance. Left foot forward, bow arm locked, drawing elbow level with the ear. Aim low, he advised, or the arrow's arc will bury it in the mud. His voice carried a hint of wry amusement, acknowledging that even a stray shaft might lodge in a thigh, or worse, a thatched roof. When it was my turn, I lifted a bow nearly as tall as myself, and, despite my best efforts, sent the first arrow veering sharply to the right, thudding into the wooden target's rim. The apprentice target retrieve, positioned to retrieve arrows, yelped as the shaft passed within inches of his leather jerkins. He ducked, heart pounding, and I flushed with mortification. Better stick to quill and parchment. He showed me how to adjust my grip, thumb under the bow, fingers relaxed, and suddenly my second arrow flew true, embedding itself in the target's center. A cheer rose from the onlookers, mingling with the creaks of the stable's timbers. I bowed theatrically, dryly noting to myself that medieval archery rewarded humility and quick correction. As twilight deepened, lanterns were lit along the range's perimeter, their flickering flames reflecting off boughs and sweating brows. Cedric spoke of how Henry's archers at Agincourt, just a few decades hence, would change the face of warfare, an insight rooted in the same wooden shafts we tested tonight. Even here, in a small village, echoes of future battles lay sleeping in simple practice. Reluctantly, I left the range and retraced my steps through lantern-lit lanes toward the tavern, where supper and the final vespers awaited. My notebook held today's lessons: the fence's cough, the shearer's skill, and now the archery lesson, laced with both peril and triumph. In this medieval world of constant labor and lurking danger, each shot, whether errant or true, revealed another layer of human resilience against uncertainty. Tomorrow would bring its own perils and progress, but for now I welcomed the comforting cloak of night. Leaving the archery range behind, I followed the warm glow of lanterns to the tavern's open door, where the scent of spiced cider and roasting onions beckoned. Inside, wooden beams dripped with years of soot, and the room thrummed with conversation. Farmers boasting of today's catch, millers comparing bread crusts, and children perched atop barrels to glimpse adult faces between swaying shoulders. I claimed a corner seat and ordered a wooden tankard of cider. A cider here was fermented slowly from autumn's apples, dry and tangy, enough to ward off chill but mild compared to stronger ales. The innkeeper's daughter, ever curious, refilled my goblet and whispered news of a drunken brawl brewing at the far table. Two laborers, cheeks flushed red from ale rather than frost, argued over a spilled deck of knucklebones, voices rising to coarse laughter and insults. Before long, one shoved the other with such force that benches lurched backward, sending mugs clattering. The innkeeper bellowed, "Enough, out!" Both of the men, emboldened by drink, crashed into the doorway. A stout constable, summoned earlier by the tavern girl, seized their shoulders. Off to the stocks with the, he snarled, his authority absolute once summoned. I followed to the pillory in the churchyard, where a rough-hewn wooden frame awaited. The constable thrust each miscreant's head and hands into the stocks, the heavy oak jaws biting into their wrists. A curious crowd gathered, some to jeer, others to throw rotten apples or mud, invoking both justice and cheap sport. The constable warned, "Quiet now, or cider's the least of your worries." One biter of knucklebones, spitting in disdain, muttered, "A mild night's work compared to the tax collector's whip." His friend moaned as the stock's wooden teeth bit deeper. I noted how medieval law was public and immediate. Punishments served as both retribution and deterrent, enacted without lawyers or prisons. Stocks were preferred for minor offenses, drunkenness, petty theft, exposing offenders to humiliation, whether and flies, until contractually released by the constable at vespers. As silence fell, villagers drifted back toward warmth and supper, leaving the bawling pair to their fate. I lingered only long enough to sketch the stock's design, simple yet effective, and record remarks about communal enforcement of order in a world without professional police. Returning to the tavern's hearth, I nursed my cider in companionable quiet, reflecting that in this medieval hamlet, rough life demanded not only labor and craft, but a communal code of justice, swift, public, and often harsh. With the stock's wooden jaws silently creaking behind me, I welcomed the tavern's smoky comfort, and soon after, the familiar lumpy straw pallet awaiting my next plunge into medieval slumber. I woke before dawn to the muffled clatter of buckets against stone, a sound so familiar it felt like a heartbeat in this village. Pulling on my tunic, I slipped outside into the cold gray light and headed straight for the communal well at the green's center. A gray mist clung to the field beyond, and the stone rim of the well was slick with last night's frost. Martha, the village water rights apprentice, knelt beside the well, winching a heavy bucket of water with a fraying hemp rope. Her breath rose in white clouds. "Morning," I greeted softly, careful not to startle her. She managed a tired grin, the ropes almost gone. "Father's off gathering new hemp twine, but he won't return until noon." I peered down the well. 2 quarts of clear water shimmered in the flickering torchlight. Fetching my own bucket, I tied it to the rope. "Need a hand?" I offered, bracing my foot against the well's edge. She nodded, and together we heaved the bucket upward, straining against gravity and our scant equipment. When it broke the surface, I let the bucket slip free. Rainwater trickled down my arm as I steadied it. Drawing the pail to the well's rim, we ladled water into barrels and jugs, our fingers numb from the chill. Suddenly, a sharp snap echoed. The rope's fibers gave way, and Martha's empty bucket plummeted into the blackness below. Her eyes widened. "My father wove that rope himself," she lamented. I knelt and peered into the shaft, but the bucket was gone. Already, the day's chores would be harder without her extra bucket to carry. Without hesitation, I suggested lowering a spare bucket from my pack, one I'd carried since first arriving, anticipating these very challenges. She brightened, relief softening her features. Together, we hauled water until the barrels brimmed. "You're a lifesaver," she said, her teeth chattering. I shrugged. "Better me than your father after a long trek." As daylight grew, villagers formed a line to draw water. Children with small pails, old women with wooden bowls, and the baker's daughter clutching a pot of milk to mix in tomorrow's porridge. I noted that water, so abundant in my own time, here dictated every household's schedule. The rope's strength as vital as any iron tool. Later, Martha's father arrived, carrying fresh hemp cord. He thanked me with a warm nod and set to splicing the new rope onto the well's winch. I watched him weave the fibers with practiced speed, thinking how each piece of this community, from the robe-wright's skill to the shared buckets, upheld a fragile balance. In this medieval world, even drawing water demanded sweat, solidarity, and readiness for sudden mishaps. And with that, I tucked the memory and a sketch of the repaired well into my ever-growing chronicle of resilience under the old sun. With fresh water secured, I turned my steps toward the chicken yard. A handful of hens clucked expectantly, scratching at the dirt in search of grubs. Young Matilda, the farmer's granddaughter, held a basket of barley and cracked corn to toss their morning ration. "They lay best when fed early," she instructed, shaking the grain so it rattled like distant hail. I scattered handfuls under Matilda's watchful eye, noting how poultry kept pecking order fierce, dominant hens jostling smaller ones for every kernel. As the hens dispersed, I approached the granary, a sturdy wattle and daub building raised on staddle stones to deter vermin. I climbed wooden steps to the loft, where sacks of barley and oats waited for the miller. The air was cool and fragrant with the scent of grain, but also tinged with an unmistakable musk. Beneath a stacked burlap sack, tiny whiskers twitched. A family of rats had chewed through the cloth, nibbling precious stock. Before I could alert the miller, a shrill squeak echoed, and the rodents darted into dark corners. I leaped back as a bold rat lunged past my foot, disappearing into the rafters. Matilda's mother, who'd followed me up, grabbed a handful of dried lavender from a hanging bundle and tossed it over the hole. "Strong smells drive them off," she explained. Though medieval pest control relied on superstitions, lavender's scent was believed to repel evil and vermin. Praxis showed that rodents disliked pungent odors. Still, she warned, a deeper remedy required sealed chests and regular sweeping to deny rats food and shelter. With the granary secured, I made my way down to help catch eggs. A group of children dashed between nesting boxes, collecting warm ovals in straw-lined baskets. One child, giggling, dropped an egg that cracked against the wooden plank, yolk oozing like morning sun. His mother chided gently, "Careful now, we can't waste what little they give." Even one broken egg mattered when protein was scarce. As I walked back through the yard, a distant, startled cry rang out. The farmer's son had stumbled over a concealed rabbit hole and twisted his ankle. Villagers rushed to help, ferrying him to the hearthside where a poultice of crushed chickweed and honey would be applied. I recalled the apothecary's lessons. Fresh herbs, raw honey, and tight bandaging could staunch pain and inhibit infection in lieu of modern painkillers. By late morning, I returned to the green, clutching a basket of eggs, my cloak dusted with hay, to observe the next chore. In this village, every task, feeding fowl, guarding grains, nursing wounds, reminded me how tenuous survival was. A snapped rope, a rat's nibble, or a simple twist of the ankle could tip daily life from order into crisis. Yet it was the ceaseless cooperation, quick innovations, and dry humor in the face of hardship that kept this medieval world turning. Midday sun filtered through ragged clouds as I made my way to the cooper's yard, a fenced area strewn with wood shavings and the clatter of mallets. Cooper Edith worked at a small vise, bending oak staves around a metal hoop. Each stave, carefully split and planed fit snugly with its neighbors to form a watertight barrel. I greeted her, and she wiped her brow, revealing a face flecked with sawdust. "Welcome," she said, handing me a shaving hook. "Fancy learning barrel building. 'Tis as essential as a strong pair of boots." She showed me how to shave the inner face of a stave down to a slight curve, ensuring tight seams when the hoop's tension squeezed them together. Barrels carry everything: grain, ale, salted meat. A leaky barrel costs weeks of labor and much-needed stores. She nodded toward a half-finished barrel still lying on its side, staves loose where the hoop had slipped earlier. Just then, a farmer rolled a newly sealed barrel toward the yard's gate. Edith gestured to me. "Watch this, and learn from his mistake." As the barrel hit a low step, a seam gave way with a wet crack. Groats of barley spilled onto the cobbles, rolling like pebbles across the yard. The farmer cursed under his breath, scrambling to scoop the grain into baskets before chickens and rats scattered it. Edith sighed. Better to inspect hoops than chase barley. She tapped each hoop with a mallet. A solid clang meant secure. A hollow ring signaled danger. Picking up a stave, I followed her instructions. Shave, test, bend, reassemble. My hands grew calloused from the shaving hook's bite, and my forearms burned from holding curves in place. Yet, as the final hoop slid over the staves, tightening with a satisfying creak, I felt the barrel firm into shape. Edith nodded in approval. "Well done," though I've seen apprentices learn faster after dropping a barrel in the pond. As we cleaned stray grooves of wood dust, Edith told me how coopers often traveled with barrels, mending leaks far from home. Her own father had journeyed to ports, repairing wine casks from Bordeaux to Bremen, proof that even a skilled villager here could connect to the wider medieval world. Later, as the afternoon cooled, I escorted the salvaged barley back to the granary, baskets clinking with the rescued grains. The day's cooper lesson reminded me that every good hinge, be it barrel, door, or plan, depended on craftsmanship, vigilance, and readiness for sudden mishaps. In a world where rough life turned on the smallest details, it was care and cooperation that kept communities from unraveling, one well-fitted hoop at a time. As the last golden rays slipped beneath the horizon, I found myself drawn to the weaver's cottage at the village edge. Smoke curled from its low chimney, and through the open door I could hear the steady clatter of a warp-weighted loom. Inside, Master Weaver Ellsworth sat amid rolls of homespun cloth, linen coarse and wool-rich, her fingers flying over threads finer than a goose quill. "Come, learn the warp from the weft," she beckoned, guiding me to a vacant seat. The warp threads, stretched taut between two beams, ran vertically, while the weft yarn wound on a shuttle, wove horizontally under and over in a precise dance. With each beat of the heedlebar, the cloth grew inch by inch. She explained that weaving required not only strength, but mathematical skill, counting threads per inch to achieve desired density, alternating patterns for durability, and adjusting tension to prevent slack that could snag on thorns or nails. "A well-woven cloth," she said, holding up a length, "lasts through seasons of wear and washing." I fingered the fabric's firm weave, marveling that such precision emerged without modern gauges or electric motors. Suddenly, a loud snap echoed as one of the warp beams cracked under tension. Threads went slack, and the shuttle fell with a clatter. Ellsworth cursed softly. The beam's oak gave out, no good for another yard. Her apprentice, a timid girl no older than 14, bit her lip. "What if we can't finish the cloth before the market leaves?" she fretted. Ellsworth's eyes softened. "We'll mend it," she said firmly, reaching for a length of supple hazel to lash the break. Together, we wove the splintered wood back into shape, securing it with strips of leather dipped in hot pitch for rigidity. By the time the final knot was tied, lantern light flickered around us, and the loom's beam held firm once more. The apprentice's relief was as bright as the candle flames. As I left the cottage, the damp evening air clung to my skin, and I recalled the day's lessons from fence weaving to barrel mending, from kill fires to tannery pits. Here at the loom, I'd witnessed that even when tools gave way, ingenuity and teamwork restored order. In this medieval corner of the world, life was a constant series of repairs, of fences, barrels, looms, and spirits alike, each one embodying the rough beauty of survival before ease was invented. Tomorrow's dawn promised fresh challenges, but for tonight, the village's steady hum of repair lulled me toward another sleep among the whispering straw. The next morning's hush was broken by a nervous creak from the church tower. Climbing the narrow, winding stair, I found old sacristan Hildebrand inspecting the thick rope that rang the bell, a lifeline of sound that marked every hour of peasant life. "Good day," I greeted as he tested the rope with a tentative tug. The hemp fibers were frayed nearly to the core. "If this gives, no vespers nor mass will reach the farthest fields," he frowned, chastising himself. My old bones should have checked this sooner. Together, we hauled down the coil of damaged rope, its strands unraveling like broken promises. I fetched the cooper's extra hemp cord, while he climbed to inspect the bell's wooden yoke. The iron bell, cast some 100 years past, had a crack half an inch long, faint yet telling of years of tolling in all weathers. "Cracked bells ring false," Hildebrand murmured. "But until the Lord spares a coin for a new one, we mend what we can." He applied a mixture of beeswax and tallow to the crack, a medieval stopgap that, while imperfect, dampened further splitting and kept the bell serviceable. By the time we rethreaded the new rope and tested the swing, the bell groaned, then rang clear, its deep tone pulsing over the waking village. Villagers paused mid-chore, offering silent thanks for sound and time's gentle guidance. Just as I stepped back into pale sunlight, a shrill cry drew my attention to the churchyard's edge. A wee lamb had strayed through a broken gate, followed by a bleeding mother, anxious for her lamb, but too heavy to slip through the opening. The woolly youngster teetered at the pond's brink, dangerously close to a deep stretch of water. Acting on instinct, I dashed forward and scooped the lamb into my arms, careful not to panic it and to keep its muddy hooves from soiling my tunic too badly. The EU's bleats turned to relieved baas as I carried her lamb back through the gate. A young shepherdess flung her arms around me. "Bless you, stranger," she sobbed. "That gate's no good. Too many lost lambs this season." Tying fresh rope to mend the latch, I reflected on how every small repair, from bell ropes to gate latches, protected this community from bigger losses. In a time when life was rough and unvarnished, vigilance and quick hands made the difference between stability and disaster. As the bell's next peal faded, I tucked these lessons into my parchment, another thread in the grand tapestry of medieval endurance. By the time the sun had crested its arc, I set out toward the irrigation ditch that bordered the eastern fields. This shallow channel, just a boot's width wide, brought water from a spring-fed feeder upstream to thirsty crops below. A narrow wooden sluice gate controlled flow, lifted by a simple lever bound in rope. Today's task: inspect for blockages and ensure blades of wheat and barley beyond received enough moisture. As I approached, my foot struck something slick near the gate. Looking down, I saw a thick mat of leaves and algae clinging to the sluice plank. Before I could react, rock loosened underfoot, and I tumbled forward, arm plunging into cold water, the lever slipping from my grasp. With a muffled creak, the gate dropped, and water surged unchecked into the fields beyond. A roar followed. The downstream ditch bank gave way in a small collapse, and water gushed onto a newly planted turnip bed, uprooting seedlings in a muddy wave. Alarmed farmers sprinted to stem the flood, wading waist-deep, using pitchforks to dam the flow with straw bales and earth. I scrambled up the bank, dripping and mortified. "Hold that bale there," shouted Osric, the head tiller, waving me over. Together we heaved soaked straw against the broken bank, packing mud around it until the water slowed to a trickle. Across the field, sprouting turnips lay sodden but largely intact. Osric clapped me on the shoulder. "No harm done. Better the flood here than on the manor roads," he joked, though sweat mixed with dirt on his brow. We righted the sluice gate lever, wedged algae back into the channel, and I helped fetch wooden shovels to reinforce the bank. By the time the crisis passed, midday meal calls echoed from the village, a welcome summons. I rinsed my muddy hand in the sluice, then made my way to the cheesemaker's hut at the pond's edge. There, a squat cottage reeked of whey and lactic temps. Inside, Agnes, the village cheesemaker, ladled fresh curds into cloth-lined forms. "Careful, they're tender," she advised, pressing each gently to expel whey and shape a firm round. She explained that cheese-making here followed traditions older than the wattle walls. Milk warmed over a gentle fire, rennet from calf stomachs, curdling it, curds separated and pressed, then aged on straw in a cool cellar. Cheese was key during winter, she said. Without it, Hunger would gnaw sharper than foxes at a hen roost. She offered me a small morsel of fresh curd, crumbly tart and cool on my tongue. As I ate, a sudden knock at the door startled us both. A breathless village messenger entered, dirt-smeared but urgent. "My lady," he panted, "riders from the next shire speak of sickness on the roads. A fever takes travelers by night, leaving them in delirium by dawn." Agnes's eyes widened as she dabbed a rag over her hands. I felt a chill unrelated to the pond's breeze. Plague rumors could spell disaster here, where even simple fevers often proved fatal. Clutching my notes and curd, I realized this small community balanced constantly on a knife edge. A sluice mishap, a sheep's misstep, or a wartime levy might disrupt the fragile equilibrium. And now, the specter of illness hovered like a raven on the horizon. Yet another test of their enduring ingenuity, solidarity, and grim humor against life's relentless uncertainties. Tomorrow's dawn would bring new tasks, and perhaps new trials, but for now, I tucked these fresh events into my chronicle, mindful that in this medieval age, no day passed without its hard-earned lesson. Word of the mysterious fever spread through the village by midday, carried in hushed whispers and urgent glances. At the market cross, a small crowd gathered as the steward's clerk, Quentin, a young man with ink-stained fingers, read aloud from the herald's letter. Travelers along the main road were falling ill with high fevers, delirium, and a spotted rash. Many never regained full strength. A tense silence followed, broken only by the distant bleat of sheep. The village council, 3 elders, the apothecary, Sibylla, the physician, Osborne, and the constable, Oswin, convened beside the church's yew tree to debate a course of action. I noted how decision-making here blended pragmatism and superstition. Sibylla argued for quarantining any newcomers in the empty granary loft, while Osborne insisted on preparing large batches of willow bark decoction, nature's aspirin, to treat early symptoms. Willow bark contains salicin, he explained, stirring a bubbling cauldron over a tripod in the graveyard's edge. Chew on the boiled chips when fever strikes. It will soothe pain and reduce heat. I tasted a spoonful, bitter as wormwood, but promising relief. Oswin sharpened pikes beside the well, ready to enforce the quarantine. No easy task in a settlement where every cottage door swung on neighborly trust. Suddenly, a young shepherd staggered into the circle, sweat beading on his brow and cheeks flushed crimson. He babbled of chills one moment and burning skin the next, sweating into his simple wool tunic. The council sprang into action. Quilts were brought to wrap him, and 2 villagers gently guided him toward the granary's loft, where he would remain apart until judged safe. His frightened bleats of water prompted Mary the goat milker to fetch fresh milk, thinking its fats might soothe his parched throat. As the friar knelt to bless the sickbay with crosses of juniper smoke, meant to drive away noxious airs, I recognized the uneasy blend of faith and folk medicine, fumigation to expel miasmas, herbal brews to ease pain, and strict isolation to halt contagion. It was a fragile web of measures, stitched together from knowledge both ancient and new, and tested by dire necessity. By late afternoon, village life had shifted. Those uninfected moved with more deliberate care, sharing water only from ladles, washing hands in vinegar washes, and avoiding the granary loft's door. Children, once free to clamor at the pond, now hovered at safe distance, their laughter cautious. Even the sound of the bell at vespers felt edged with urgency, a summons not only to prayer but to vigilance. As I recorded these events, I marveled at how medieval communities, though lacking microscopes or quarantine wards, deployed a mixed arsenal of remedies, rituals, and communal resolve to face even an invisible enemy. Tonight's vigil would last long after torchlight faded, each hour marked by a quiet prayer for the shepherd's recovery and the village's endurance. In this rough world, survival demanded more than muscle and grain. It called for collective courage and hearts braced against despair. Night had fallen like a velvet cloak when I slipped past the apothecary's hut to check on the quarantined shepherd. The granary loft was lit by a single rushlight, its flame wavering against rough plastered walls. I climbed the ladder quietly, heart pounding as the shepherd moaned in his coarse straw bed, his forehead cool beneath a willow bark poultice. I hovered to offer fresh decoction in a wooden cup, when a sudden skittering noise froze me mid-step. From the far corner, a family of rats, bold and famished, emerged, drawn by spilled barley kernels. They gnawed at the edges of the shepherd's bedding, inches from where he lay shivering. "Shoo," I hissed, stamping a boot. 2 rats darted behind the piled sacks, but the others pressed on. Without thinking, I grabbed a length of rope, still coiled from the well repair, and flailed at the nearest rat. My improvised lasso miraculously flinging one rodent clear of the straw. It landed in a pile of grain, squealing indignantly before scrambling away. The others dispersed at my clumsy racket, leaving the loft silent, save for the shepherd's labored breaths. Heart hammering, I rebuked myself. If rats carried disease, I'd risk contaminating the ill man's fragile constitution. Scrambling down, I fetched a lantern, a handful of lavender sachets, and a sharpened stick. Back in the loft, I scattered lavender around the bed, its pungent aroma reputed to repel rodents, and used the stick to shove loose barley away from the corners. Within minutes, the loft was cleared of both grain and vermin. Panting, I returned to the shepherd's side. His breathing had eased, and he murmured, "Thank you." I cradled his hand, noting how even in sleep each shallow inhale demanded effort, a stark reminder that in this age, before inoculation, disease was as relentless as any storm or fire. I refilled the poultice beneath his forehead and whispered a prayer of thanks to the community's combined remedies: isolation to halt contagion, willow bark to dull pain, juniper smoke to cleanse the air, and lavender to guard against vermin. Then I retreated into the hushed night, ladder clattering softly as I descended. Outside, the moon shone pale. I paused on the green, inhaling cold air heavy with the promise of frost. Tomorrow would bring petitions to the manor for more aid, perhaps extra herbs from neighboring villages, and the hope that the shepherd's fever would break. In this rough, unyielding medieval world, survival depended on resourcefulness, swift action, even if that meant lassoing rats, and the courage to confront each new threat by torchlight and by dawn. With that, I tucked my coat around me and hurried back to my straw pallet, once again grateful for the simple luxury of sleep, even if it came with the whisper of skittering feet and the pulse of a distant, tolling bell. My sleep was shallow, each distant peal of the church bell reminding me that even rest came at a premium in this harsh world. Before sunrise, I donned my cloak and slipped toward the common pasture beyond the village's thatched soles. Their cows and sheep grazed on frost-kissed grass, tended by a lone shepherd whose duty spanned twilight to dawn, chasing wolves more by hope than by certainty. I greeted Elfric, the night shepherd, who leaned on his crook as he scanned the tree line. Wolves roam close, he murmured, pointing to broken fence pickets where teeth had gnawed wood through weeks of hunger. He held a lantern aloft, its weak glow more a beacon for courage than a deterrent to predators. He explained that wolf packs had grown bold near harvest's end, driven by the scent of lambs and the lull of village hearths. Night watches, armed only with spears and lanterns, fanned out to deter raids. I volunteered to join his circuit, lantern held high, heart thumping as we circled the flock. Halfway around the perimeter, Elfric froze. A moment's hush, then a low, mournful howl rose from the dark woods, sending a chill deeper than any frost. The sheep froze too, their bleats stifled by instinct. Elfric raised his crook and called a steadying chant to calm the flock. I gripped my own staff more tightly, listening as another howl answered from across the field. "Not close enough yet," he whispered, voice grim. We waited, breath visible in the cold air, until the wolves' voices faded behind the pines. By lantern light, Elfric inspected each torn picket, jamming sharpened stakes and braided hazel rods into gaps. A crude patch, he admitted, but enough to slow them. His dry grin betrayed that even in heartbreak he found room for gallows humor, better patched than turned into dinner. With the dawn's first flush painting the eastern sky, we guided the animals toward the village pens. Each hoofall echoed on hard earth, a reminder that survival here meant vigilance before dawn, endurance under the noonday sun, and resourcefulness in the face of every threat, be it animal, illness, or weather. As I returned under growing light to the village green, I jotted down the night's lesson, that in a medieval world, unsoftened by fences of iron ore, the promise of reinforcements. Each night brought its own perils, and each morning fresh proof that life's fragility demanded unwavering courage and the resolve to mend. Broken pickets before the wolves found their way in. By the time the sun had fully topped the eastern hill, villagers had gathered at the field edges once more, this time not for labor, but to inspect the damage wrought by last night's sudden frost. Jackets hastily donned over tunics, we trudged across damp soil toward the turnip and cabbage patches, the air still crisp enough to cloud each breath. Mistress Alfwyn led the group, her lantern now repurposed as a clipboard for tallying losses. She knelt beside a row of cabbages, their outer leaves blackened and brittle. "Frost bites the cell sap," she explained, brushing her mittened hand over the damaged heads. "Once that green turns brown, the vegetable spoils. No amount of pickling can save it." A murmur of dismay rippled through the crowd. These cabbages had been slated for winter stores, and without them, survival would grow lean. Nearby, a farmer prodded a withered turnip plant, declaring its bulb a foul mush beneath shriveled leaves. "Better to sow more barley," he grumbled, "than guard frost-bitten roots." But seed for barley was likewise precious, held in village granaries, now strained by the recent flood mishap. I noted how medieval agronomy hinged on anticipating, yet could not always forestall, nature's whims, and how a single night's chill could undermine months of toil. As the group regrouped, the steward's clerk, Quentin, read aloud a petition drafted by the village council, a request to the manor lord for emergency relief seed, be it peas, rye, or turned under clover, to replant faded fields. "We propose shared labor in return," Alfwyn added, "with 8 days forgiven for every sack granted." I admired the pragmatic reciprocity, peasants offering service in exchange for grain, weaving obligation with survival. Suddenly, a shrill cry cut through the calm. A small boy had slipped on icy ground at the field edge and tumbled headfirst into a shallow ditch. He sat up, stunned but uninjured, save for a bloody lip. Hands rushed to his side, women offering scarves to staunch the cut, men hoisting him upright. He grinned through tears, whispering, "Didn't break a bone, thank the saints." Laughter mingled with relieved sighs as they guided him back toward the cottages. This little accident underscored how every task, surveying frost damage, drafting petitions, or simply crossing muddy ground, bore risk in a world without stable roads or safe flooring. Life here was a ballet of caution and care, yet always shadowed by sudden hazards. By late morning, with petitions folded and banners of damaged crops swaying behind us, the villagers headed home to marshal supplies for replanting if seed arrived, and to prepare a midday meal of pottage flavored perhaps with what cabbage remained. As I noted each detail, botanical, bureaucratic, and bruised, I realized that medieval endurance demanded not only steadfast labor, but a readiness to stumble, pick oneself up, and ask for help when the fields themselves had failed. After the frost assessment, I withdrew to the edge of the village, where the communal latrine stood, a low wattle hut perched above a deep pit, its wooden door bearing a crudely painted sign. "Here lies all we wish never to revisit." Stepping inside required courage. The air was thick with ammonia, and flies buzzed like miniature dragonflies darting among vertical wooden slats. Inside, a single plank spanned the pit, its rear end cut away to form 2 seat holes. Beneath, a foul abyss awaited. I noted the hut's design, elevated to prevent flooding into the pit, covered by a thatch roof to keep rain from diluting the contents and accelerating stench. A narrow shelf held strips of cloth twisted into crude toilet paper, which villagers washed and reused, a necessity in an age without soft pulp. As she worked, I asked about hygiene, whether anyone thought to wash hands afterward. She snorted. "Waters for cooking and ale. Hands get wiped on breeches or sleeve. If you can't endure a bit of dirt, best stay in a castle with chamber pot." Her dry humor undercut a bitter truth. Medieval sanitation depended on laborious maintenance and a high tolerance for stench and sickness. Just then, a sudden squeal erupted from outside. The village cat, drawn by the pit's promise of vermin, had slipped on the latrine's wooden step and landed headfirst into an empty bucket beside the hut. Jane paused mid-scoop, raised an eyebrow, and called, "Someone rescue the muggy before he thinks this is his new home." A boy darted forward, appending the bucket to free the dazed cat, which leaped away, spraying foul-smelling water everywhere. We both burst into laughter, despite the reek. Jane slapped ash on her scoop and handed me a pinch to carry. "Take this for your travels," she said, "and remember, in this world, cleaning up after others is just as vital as sowing fields, or else rot claims us all." Leaving the latrine's pungent lessons behind, I followed the babble of a nearby brook to the basket-maker's clearing, a sunny glade where supple willow rods lay in neat bundles. The basket-maker, Winflade, a spry woman with forearms mottled from years of soaking wood, greeted me with a broad smile. "Come learn to tamper necessity into art," she said, guiding me to a half-finished market basket. As Winflade wove the sides upward, she explained that baskets came in many shapes, shallow for eggs, tall for herbs, deep for foraged nuts and berries. Each design suited its cargo: grass baskets for light grains, willow for heavy roots, Apprentices learned the craft by age 10, ensuring family skill stayed alive across generations. By late afternoon, the sun re-emerged, drying the glade's sodden grass. Windflade set me weaving again, praising my even tension. I reflected that a sudden downpour, an everyday annoyance, here served as both challenge and lesson. In a rough, medieval life, one learned to adapt tools and techniques to weather's whims, turning each interruption into an opportunity for innovation and teamwork. With my first willow basket completed, I tucked it under my arm, ready for the next chapter of this living chronicle. As the day's light waned, I returned to the tavern, willow basket laden with fresh herbs and just forged eggs. The hearth roared under a cauldron simmering with small beasts of the forest, rabbits caught by traps set near the wood's edge. Inside, villagers gathered on rough benches around long oak trestles, laden with trenchers of pottage, slices of venison, and wheels of fresh cheese. I proffered my basket to the innkeeper's daughter. Those herbs will ward off chill and chase stale airs from our bones. I nodded, grateful for her patience in teaching simple but vital culinary arts. Medieval kitchens whirled on whatever grew nearby and what traditions dictated. Fence stakes snapped under pressure, and only quick thinking saved the garden's produce. A weaver chimed in, comparing snapped warp beams to the farmer's luck, and soon a chorus of dry jokes bounced around the rafters like merry sparks. I reflected on another day in this medieval tapestry. The looms protest and repair, the frosts bite, the mills creak, the latrines lessen, the midday flood, the baskets soak, the kitchen's bruised shin. But fear not, nothing escapes his light for long. He dispatched the constable, Oswin, to secure the doors, and summoned every able villager to the nave by crow. By dawn's first rosy flush, villagers gathered in the cold stone aisle, the baker, the miller, the apothecary, Sibylla, the wheelwright, and the traveling sutler whose cart had appeared 3 days ago. Whispers passed like a draught through the crowd. Suspicion flickered in anxious eyes. Murmurs rose as the sutler opened his canvas bag. Inside, nestled among rags, gleamed the stolen chalice. Malric's face drained of color. It was for safekeeping, he stammered. The villagers pressed close. The baker spat, a fine excuse for thievery. The miller added, better burned than bargained. Oswin led the sutler, chalice in hand, out to the churchyard stocks. There Malric remained until Vesper's head and hands locked in place, a lesson in communal justice. Meanwhile, Father Benedict recovered the chalice, anointed it with holy water, and returned it to its place of honor. But the strength of shared belief and social bonds reclaimed it just as quickly. With the chalice restored and the sutler humbled, the dawn's light truly felt blessed, and I, clutching my quill, added this unexpected tale of theft and redemption to my ever-growing chronicle of medieval resilience. After the chalice's return and the sutler's disgrace, villagers dispersed to resume their labors with renewed solemnity. I joined Mistress Alfwin and her small band at the barley field, where golden stalks bowed heavy with ripeness. Each reaper wielded a curved scythe, its keen blade honed by the blacksmith's apprentice only yesterday. I hefted a scythe in my own hands, heavier than expected, and mimicked her motion, slicing a neat bundle that fell with a dry rustle. Just then, a sudden clang and a sharp cry split the air. I spun to see young Brenna, who'd taken my earlier bundle, standing stunned as her scythe's blade slipped off the handle, the iron head flying free and embedding itself in the soil inches from her foot. Her pail of barley toppled, stalks scattering like startled birds, while two men, one a wheelwright, the other the baker's apprentice, rushed to retrieve the blade and check her ankle for injuries. Fortunately, Brenna's foot had escaped unscathed. The baker's apprentice applied a wash of lavender and comfrey poultice to her shins, enough to soothe bruising should it arise, and handed it to Brenna with a gentle admonishment. Never let a tool's fault go unheeded. A loose blade can cost more than grain. Brenna nodded, cheeks flushed with relief and embarrassment, then resumed her reaping with renewed care. Together, we finished the row, bundles stacking like cornucopias against the hedgerow, and paused to wipe sweat and share water from a communal skin. In this medieval world, where each labor and each tool carried latent danger, communal aid and swift improvisation turned near disaster into mere anecdote, ready to be woven into the village's living lore. With harvest pressing on, hard work resumed, but each swing of blade and binding of sheaf carried a silent tribute to the day's shared vigilance. By mid-afternoon, the harvested barley sheaves were stacked in neat stooks, drying in the sun's slanted rays. It was time for threshing, separating grain from chaff using flails and the village's modest threshing floor, a compacted earth circle cleared of stones. I followed Alfwin and Brenna, along with half a dozen villagers, to the clearest spot nearest the pond. Spread the sheaves into a single layer, Alfwin instructed, positioning each bundle head inward around the circle's edge. Then we beat the grain free. She lifted a flail, 2 wooden rods hinged by leather, and demonstrated a measured swing that struck the sheaf with satisfying crack. I took my own flail, feeling its weight, and mimicked her. My first strike scattered kernels, but also sent dust clouding our circle. As we worked, the rhythmic thwack of wood on barley was punctuated by laughter and easy banter. A flail's design dated back to antiquity, and though crude, it harnessed simple mechanics, a head accelerating under centrifugal force, delivering more impact than a straight club. Villagers traded tips, how a lower stance improved control, or how rotating hands prevented wrist fatigue. Suddenly, a lithe shape darted across the floor, a long-tailed weasel drawn by the scent of spilled grain. It scampered beneath a flail strike, snatched a lone barley kernel in its jaws, then vanished into the undergrowth with surprising speed. Brenna watched, wide-eyed. A thief, smaller than any we guard against. She laughed, and bolder than some humans I know. We paused briefly to refill our water skins and to admire the weasel's audacity, proof that even the smallest creatures carved their own niches in medieval life, driven by the same hunger and resourcefulness as humans. Once the circle was clear of grain, the spread of sheaves thinned to a dusty carpet, and we gathered the loose kernels into wicker baskets. Next, the winnowing fan would separate chaff by tossing grain aloft so wind could carry away husks, another communal task for tomorrow's dawn. As the day cooled, the baker arrived with a horse-drawn cart. His pride, the first batch of fresh flour from last week's milling. He tipped buckets of pale powder onto the threshing floor, transforming our dusty ring into a blinding white swirl. Children raced in circles, faces smeared, and elders scooped handfuls to sift through their hands, marveling at the fine grain that would become bread, hard-earned sustenance in a world where every kernel counted. Before I left, Alfwin paused and placed a hand on my shoulder. You see how each step, from scythe to flail to winnowing, depends on neighbors' help and human grit, she said. That's the true harvest. Shared effort, I packed my notes and watched as the returning flock of villagers carried baskets of kernels back to the granary, a living testament to medieval life's roughness, its daily surprises, and the enduring spirit that turned every sheaf of grain into hope for another dawn. As twilight settled, I followed the deep clatter of barrels to the village brewery, a low stone building beside the mill pond, its courtyard strewn with spent grains and frothy ale stains. Inside, Master Brewer Rolf hovered over a massive wooden vat, steam rising in fragrant clouds of malt and yeast. "Evening," he greeted, wiping his hands on a stained apron. "Come, learn how we turn barley's kernels into liquid gold." He gestured to a pile of pale malted barley on a broad table. "We steep barley in water for 2 days, allow it to germinate, then dry it on the kiln floor. Starch converts to sugar. Without this, yeast cannot feast." I peered at the glowing kill pit, recalling the charcoal burner's kill, and noting how each craft interlinked. Rolf scooped a handful of crushed malt into a copper kettle and poured in hot water. As sugars dissolved, the brew thickened into sweet wort. "Next," he said, pouring the wort into the vat through a coarse strainer, "we add groot herbs like yarrow, juniper, and mugwort for flavor and preservation before pitching yeast." He invited me to sniff a pinch of dried yarrow, bitter, piney, with a surprising warmth on the tongue. Just as he measured a scoop of yeast, a sudden hiss erupted. The VAT's rear staves split, sending a geyser of warm wort across the dirt floor. Rolf shouted, dancing back as the sticky stream oozed into cracks. I grabbed a length of rope from my basket and, with his apprentice's help, lashed the staves together. A handful of spare moss, pressed into the seam, temporarily sealed the leak until tomorrow's planned coopering repairs. "Every vessel leaks eventually," Rolf quipped, patting the repaired side. "A brewer learns to patch as well as pour." He handed me a wooden ladle. I dipped it into the still steaming brew, tasting the sweet sour liquid. "Tastes like triumph," I said, wiping sticky drips from my chin. By lamplight, Rolf stirred the vat to oxygenate the wort, then sealed it with cloth to ferment overnight. He explained that yeast converted sugars to alcohol and carbon dioxide over days, and that careful temperature control, impossible without modern thermometers, depended on feeling the barrel's warmth by hand. Before leaving, Rolf poured me a small flagon of today's cask ale, freshly racked and cloudy with yeast. We toasted to community craft and quick fixes. Then I stepped into the cool night air, flagon in hand. In this medieval world, even a broken vat became a lesson in human ingenuity, and a fine anecdote to record as night's last bell tolled. Before first light filtered the eastern sky, I trudged from my lean-to toward the bakehouse, drawn by the promise of fresh bread, a rarity to savor before chores called the baker. Aldred stood by a low stone slab, unwrapping cloths that swaddled overnight's loaves. Steam curled like morning mist as he tested each crust with a tap of his knuckles. "Be quick," he murmured. "Bread's scarce. Today's rations must stretch." He sliced a large round into wedges, one for every household, plus a few extras for the widow and infirm. I watched as villagers formed a line by lantern light, clutching wooden trenchers. Each accepted their wedge with a solemn nod. No one dared grumble at the coarse rye and barley blend that crackled like gravel beneath teeth. When my turn came, I lifted my trencherman's cap and thanked Aldred. He handed me an oddly light wedge. Its center crumb collapsed. "Cracked loaf," he admitted. "Oven's hottest spot burned through." eat the edges, feed the core to the pigs. His dry grin revealed pride in salvaging what he could. I tucked the brittle top under my arm, mindful that even spoiled bread here became precious starch for animals or seed for next year's grain. Just as I turned to leave, a soft cry rose from the shadows. A small boy, clutching his trencherman's cap, stared at an empty hand. He'd let his turn slip in the dark and watched his bread pass to another. Before he could choke back tears, a woman stepped from the line, Mary, the goat milker, breaking her wedge in two. "Here, lad," she said, pressing half into his palm. "Better to share than let sorrow grow." His gratitude twinkled brighter than any hearth fire. I reflected on medieval charity, communal ovens, and shared loaves bound villagers against hunger's threat. Even a cracked loaf held the power to mend hearts. With bread secured, edible or not, I strode toward the scriptorium in the manor's solar, eager to record this simple act of compassion alongside lessons in baking, farming, and crisis response. As dawn finally broke, I tucked my notes beneath the broken crust, ready to witness the day's next challenge. The blacksmith's forging of winter plowshares, then the spark that flew when iron met ice. "Today we forge plowshares," the blacksmith announced, lifting a glowing billet from the hearth. "These curved blades must cut furrows deep enough to turn heavy clay soil." He set the bar on the anvil and delivered measured hammer blows, each strike shaping the steel's angle. I noted how the heavy plow, an innovation of the early Middle Ages, allowed northern European soils to be tilled efficiently, revolutionizing agriculture and fueling population growth. As he worked, he explained forging temperatures. Red heat, around 200 degrees Fahrenheit, softens iron enough to shape. Then we normalize by heating to yellow and air cooling, which reduces brittleness. When the share's cutting edge took form, he quenched it in the trough beside the forge. The hiss was deafening, steam rising like miniature geysers, quenching locks in hardness, he said, patting the steaming trough's rim with a leather glove. His apprentice, still new to the flaming crucible, leaned in too far, and a rogue spark leaped onto his sleeve. He yelped as embers danced across the coarse fabric. Quick as a cat, the blacksmith slapped the apprentice's arm with a damp cloth, smothering the spark before it could ignite fully. "Mind the sparks," he chided gently, "for even a small ember can burn cloth and flesh." The apprentice rubbed his arm, face pale, then offered a shaky nod and returned his attention to hammering. Once the plowshare's blade was crisp and true, the blacksmith ground a bevel using a leather-bound stone, a process demanding both muscle and keen eye. He held the finished share aloft, its edge reflecting sunlight, and laid it beside a wooden mold ready for casting the coulter, a stout iron disc that would precede the blade, scoring the ground. As I walked away, the steady clang of hammer on anvil receded, replaced by the village's multifaceted soundtrack, clucking hens, laughter from children playing by the pond, and the distant tolling of the midday bell. In this medieval world, every forged iron piece carried the weight of generations' labor, an emblem of human ingenuity wresting food and shelter from stubborn land. And even as sparks flew, sometimes dangerously, the smith's steady hand and quick reflexes forged not only metal, but the very resilience that sustained life in these hard-won fields. With plowshares cooled and primed, I joined the blacksmith, the wheelwright, and a handful of stout farmers at the edge of a newly turned trial furrow. The heavy wooden plow, its beam oiled and fitted with gleaming iron coulter and share, waited like a beast tamed only by human will. "Ready your grip," the wheelwright cautioned, bracing the plow's handles. He'd mounted the coulter, a round iron disc, to precede the share, cutting a clean line for the blade. The farmer in front hefted the plow's harness across his shoulders, positioning the oxen team in yoke. With a nod, he urged them forward. The coulter spun as it bit the soil, but halfway down the furrow, a harsh crack rang out. The coulter's rim fractured, splintering under the clay's resistance. The oxen halted, snorting in surprise, as clods of earth rumbled from the groove. The farmer swore under his breath, wiping sweat and dust from his brow. The blacksmith knelt to inspect the break, a jagged fissure where the iron grain had cooled too quickly. "Mist-tempered," he muttered. "We'll need to weld a patch or fashion a new disc." Yet a fresh coulter hung unused in the forge, but its axle hole was too large for this plow's shaft. Seeing urgency, the wheelwright rummaged in his cart for leather offcuts and wooden shims. He hammered the shims into the oversized bore, then wrapped several coats of thick leather around the axle until the new disc fit snugly. I helped tighten the leather bindings with waxed cord. Standing back, the wheelwright gave the repaired coulter a tentative nudge with his mallet. "May it hold," he grinned. The farmer repositioned the plow, and with a collective heave, the oxen lurched forward. The coulter bit true, cutting a straight furrow that the share followed, lifting sod in neat curls. Cheers rose as the plow labored on under sun and sweat. As dust settled, I noted how medieval repair relied on resourcefulness, leather, wood, and sheer determination to keep tools working under unforgiving conditions. A broken coulter threatened an entire season's tilling, yet quick minds and ready hands turned near disaster into yet another testament of ingenuity. With the furrow complete, we paused to share water from a communal skin and marvel at the simple triumph. A patched tool carving life's path one furrow at a time. By late afternoon, I left the furrowed fields to follow the echo of cleaving wood toward the forest's edge. There, a modest clearing hosted the village's woodcutter, Wulfric, and his apprentice, wielding the long Tumen pits saw that split logs into beams. The air smelled of pine, resin, and sawdust, mingling with the distant temps of the brewery's mashing vats. First, fell the tree with an axe, then limit, and finally bucket, Wulfric intoned, pointing to a felled oak whose trunk lay ready. With a practiced swing, he hewed a notch at the base, then delivered a precise finishing blow that sent the tree crashing, branches spiraling into the clearing. I jumped back as a spray of leaves rained down, marveling at how essential wood was, framing houses, firing kilns, and fueling hearth fires that sustained warmth through winter's bite. Next came the pit saw, positioned above and below the log. Wulfric and his apprentice took handles, working the blade in a smooth, reciprocating motion. With each pull and push, the beam deepened by a hair's breadth, the sawdust piling like golden snow. The technique dated to Roman times, yet endured for its simplicity, muscle power, and gravity. Doing a smith's work in miniature, suddenly the log shifted on its cradle, a misjudged cut on the underside, and lurched toward the apprentice. He froze as the heavy timber pivoted, its weight threatening to crush his foot. In one swift motion, Wulfric shoved him aside, the log thudding harmlessly onto a bed of leaves. Apprenticeship, he later told me with a wry grin, demanded constant vigilance. One slip could mean a broken bone, or worse. Recovering, the apprentice rubbed his wrist. then offered a sheepish bow. Wulfric clapped him on the shoulder. Lesson learned. Respect the woods. Wait, young one, or it will remind you harshly. I noted how medieval craftsmen paired skill with caution, hard-earned over long seasons under open skies. Once the beam lay split, Wulfric used an adze to smooth its surface, each stroke flattening the rough face, readying it for framing a roof or reinforcing a wattle wall. He explained how timber framing with mortise and tenon joinery created sturdy homes that withstood wind and weather. As the sun dipped low, I helped carry the freshly hewn beam back to the village workshop, my arms burning with the weight. Each piece of timber told a story of tree, axe, saw, and human perseverance. Another testament that in this rugged world, every structure began with sweat, danger, and the humbling power of nature harnessed one swing at a time. As dusk settled into full night, I made my way to the chandler's hut, a low thatched building whose windows glowed like watchful eyes. Inside, rows of skewers held dripping candles in various stages of formation. Chandler Rowena stood at her bench, sleeves rolled, a gleaming pot of molten tallow at her elbow. "Welcome," she called, ladle in hand. "Candles are lifeblood once the sun sets." She dipped a length of twisted wick into the molten fat, then lifted it to drip and rest on a wooden peg. Each drip built layer upon layer, the hot tallow pooling, then hardening to form a sturdy taper. Beeswax is finer, burns clean, and smells sweet, but costlier by far. Tallows, humble, smoky, and affordable. A single slice of fat makes dozens of candles. I marveled at how her craft dated to antiquity, yet remained essential. Without candles or rushlights, medieval nights were bound in darkness. Rowena explained that each household rationed candlelight, reserving evenings for urgent tasks, finishing mending, studying scripture, or tending infirm loved ones. "One candle burns an hour if well trimmed," she said, trimming a wick with snips to maintain steady flame. As she worked, a sudden gust rattled the door, and a tray of half-formed tapers tumbled from their skewers. The dripping candles landed in a greasy heap, warping together. Rowena gasped. These imperfect candles would burn unevenly, smoke excessive, and drip dangerously. She cursed softly as I helped separate them, using a knife to pry tails apart. Even in darkness, mishaps strike swiftly, she sighed, stacking the recovered candles on a low shelf to reset. While we labored, she spoke of how candles featured in church rituals, guild meetings, and bedside vigils. In times of plague or famine, people offered extra tapers at shrines to plead for mercy. "A candle's flame, though small, kindles hope," she said, lighting one from her hearth's embers and holding it aloft. Its feeble glow danced on the smoky walls like a fragile promise. Before I left, Rowena handed me a slender taper as gift and reminder. "Carry this with you on the darkest path." Outside, I tucked it into my cloak, struck a flint to ignite its wick, and watched the small flame flicker against the vast medieval night in a world rough and shadowed by peril. Even a single candle's glow held the power to guide, to comfort, and to teach that human resilience shone brightest when all else fell dark.